hablar un poco de notas científicas, especialmente notas de laboratorio. Y esto es el mismo que he presentado hace varios años. Tenía pensado presentar otra cosa, pero es por petición. Estoy repitiendo. Voy a presentar en español, entonces me puedes corregir o informarme si algo no es claro inmediatamente, por favor. Okay.
Everybody speaks English, no?
Well, I was going to do Spanish because this morning there was so many talks in Spanish. So, does anybody not understand?
Esto dilo en español.
¿Ah?
Esto pregúntalo en español.
Okay. ¿Alguien no me comprende bien si presento en inglés? O porque la idea es que dar información del formato y importancia de notas en el laboratorio, y por esto lo más importante es la transmisión de la información. ¿Alguien tiene problemas si hablo en inglés? ¿Me vas a decir si Okay.
Probablemente es más fácil entenderte en inglés.
Okay. In that case, I will present in English. I will try, but if anything is not clear, please just immediately interrupt me and ask me to repeat or use other words right away, please. So, I am going to talk about lab notes. And so, well, scientific notes in general, but lab notes in specific. And so, this is the bedrock of science, is taking notes on what we're doing. And this is how we can remember and document. Here is a photograph of one of the earliest phylogenetic trees in the notes of Darwin. And so if you're planning on being a famous scientist, then you should make good notes, because in a few hundred years, other people will be using them in talks. But it is a permanent chronological record of your experiments. So that means you need to write them all down, even if they don't work. So it is the primary record of the experiments, and as such, it is the legal documentation of your experiments. So this is how you can show that you did it and what you did. So there are certain things that need to be in your notes for them to be complete and them to be valid legal documents. So you always need to have a date on the page or on your experiment. A title of what it is you're doing, maybe a PCR reaction or DNA extraction or whatever it is. The method that you're using. So if you use the same exact method many times, you can just refer to it as that method. Like, I'm going to run a 2% agarose gel or something like that, without putting all the details. You can put all the details once and then just refer back to that method. But you do need the complete details when it's the first time that you do something. So this is an appropriate place to put observations or notes about what you're doing. And you can also, we now keep a lot of data in our computers, and the output of many analysis is a data file in a computer, and so you can just refer to those files in your notes. And it's also a good place to put some evaluation of what you've done and what you're going to do next. Like, oh, those conditions work really well, use those again. Or, oh, next time I need to change the annealing temperature, for example. And so if you've made a mistake or an error has happened in your experiment, this is also the place to note it. So even if it's kind of embarrassing, like, oh, I stuck my thumb in it, that explains maybe why it didn't work or why it was contaminated. And so it's important to put those kinds of notes, to include them in the lab notes and not just sort of pretend they didn't happen. So every experiment, whether it worked or whether it didn't work or whether you put your thumb in it or whatever, should be recorded. And so your notes, they're very important, and they should be complete enough that somebody else can understand them. So the person, whoever is sitting next to you, should be able to pick up your notebook and figure out quite exactly what you've done and replicate it if it was necessary. Yeah, you're lucky to be sitting next to me. So yes, without your aid. So your name should be on the book. This documents that it's you that did the work. Sometimes there are notebooks that are maybe shared between a few people for a particular project. Then you should put your name on each page to show who did that particular experiment. Date needs to be on every experiment. And it needs to be written in a way that it is basically permanent. So like ballpoint pens are good. Ink gel pens run in the odd case that maybe something spills, which does occasionally happen, or something like that, yes. And so if you've written something incorrect and you want to change it, that happens, you should draw a line through it so you can still see what it was and not block it out, not completely black it out or rip out pages. So you should not rip pages out of your notebook. You can cross out the whole page like, oh, that whole thing was just a bad idea, or oops, I left a blank page, draw a line through it. Because, you know, all sorts of things happen and that's fine. The idea is to document it, not to change it. And this is something that I see a lot of is loose material. And one prime example of this is little printouts of gels. They need to be attached to the notebook, not just sort of stuck in one of the pages and hope that you can remember which day you did that one. And so part of these is also that they should not leave the building. Your lab books should stay in the lab until you're done using them. So when your experiment is done, the long-term storage place isn't the lab, but during the experiment, they should stay in the lab. And even when you're done with the experiment, done with that lab book, you can take it out of the lab and store it, but in this building. So if you, like me, maybe sometimes want to work at home and need your notes, you can make a scan or a copy of any or all of the pages, and that's a nice backup plan to have a copy of your notes, but you should not be taking your lab book home. Yeah, you probably shouldn't take it to your office because it's probably covered in chemicals too.
Why
So-
not take it home?
Well,
It's more convenient to work.
it is more convenient to work at home, and I'm not at all saying you shouldn't work at home, but you should work with a copy, because when it leaves the building, there's always the risk of it being lost. And these, I'm hoping to get across the point that these are important legal documents. And although you, as the person who has done the experiments, has some claim over the intellectual property, the data is not yours, it belongs to CSIC. And it's also probably covered with dangerous chemicals. So that's another reason why it's not good to take it to your office or at home. So it is a legal document, and they are used in things like court cases. Obviously, hopefully, that won't be a common theme in any of your work, but it does sometimes happen, and I personally have been sent scans of other people's notebooks to evaluate for court cases. It happens, and it's very important that they're clear. But the primary use, the most common and most important to each of you use of your notes is going to be by yourself and your group to, when you go to write your paper, when you go to write your thesis, you think you're going to remember everything, but I promise you will not. And in 10 or 20 years, when somebody sends you an email, oh, you know, now I see those old data in a new way, and I need those sequences or the conditions of something, and they send you an email, you are not going to remember. You should write everything down. The primary use is going to be for you. So good notes will benefit you personally, directly, and hopefully in the reasonably short term. But it is quite common to have requests by other researchers who want to build on your research. If you've done something interesting and important, others hopefully will want to build on it, and that's good. In less common, but still reasonably frequent, there are issues that come up with regard to ownership of data and issues about publications that may be adjudicated once a paper has been submitted by the editor of a journal. And so being able to document what you've done will help that go much more smoothly. On a more serious level, sometimes, and less frequent, but more serious, would be an institutional inquiry or a fraud inquiry. And these kinds of things, they're not frequent. Hopefully they never impact any of you, but if they do, having good notes will cover you, and it's the only way to be covered. So, good notes. So during the project, the notes should stay in the lab, not going back and forth to your office where maybe you have a snack in the morning, or you have your hand lotion, or some other way that you could accidentally transfer chemicals onto yourself. And they should not ever leave the building. Although if you want to work on them outside the building, copies of them are fabulous. You can make photocopies or scans as much as you want. And yeah, and the notebook should remain complete and not rip things out of it. So when the project is done, the notebooks should stay here even if you leave, although you can take copies of them with you. And it's important, so you have sort of an obligation, a 10-year obligation, that is the obligation of the PI, right, basically. But requests can come in longer. And so I encourage you all to take really good notes, and it will help you do better, excellent science. Okay, so now we're going back to the more exciting part, and we'll now